Chapter 6. When Sig had told Lincoln that he would personally guarantee Chloe Baldwin's safety, he seemed to ease his mind. Lincoln and his wife decided to check on the hospital where Ethan McCarthy, Samuel Godwinson, and Levi Crawford were staying, as it seemed divine key-bearers were being targeted. They declined any help, insisting that with the ultimate sword and shield, they were quite safe. The two of them got into a horse-drawn carriage and rode into the night. Chloe was glad to have Sig close to her. Though she feared the unrelenting power of Catherine Page, there was a calm strength that she felt around Sig. The others began making preparations for battle. Lizard had scouted the enemy and reported they were about 10,000 strong in number, and armed mostly with spears, axes, and other melee tools. Strategy conversations with Lucas had been brief. He had suggested lining the road with mines might succeed in slowing or confusing the armies, but that the real strategy was to imprison Catherine Page herself. He had warned of the dangers of actually killing her, since that would cause an alteration in the timeline and most likely pull them into their own time again. Also, he pointed out that time would fill her role with someone else, and that attempts to actually alter history significantly would probably be unsuccessful. The only other point of clarification was how to imprison the necromancer. Lucas had suggested that Kirana use her sword and cut a deep hole in the ground, and that Lizard could get debris teleported on top of her to bury her alive. The idea was distasteful, but Stephanie finally indicated that it would probably be successful. With this strategy set, Lizard left to gather extra debris, and Kirana left with Jonathan to dig a hole. Chloe brought a glass of water to Sig as he looked out the large window in the hall at the top of her home and observed their progress. "Mr. West," she said with a smile, "I thought you might be thirsty." He turned and smiled widely. Chloe blushed slightly as his hand brushed hers, and he took the cup. "Miss Baldwin," said Sig, "you read my mind." "I didn't really," said Chloe as Sig gulped the cool water. "You might as well have," said Sig as he wiped his mouth and handed the glass back to her. "That was exactly what I needed." Chloe smiled as she took the cup. "So it looks like you're going with young Mr. Flynn's plan, then?" asked Chloe as Sig watched Kirana cut the earth in the road outside the house. "Mr. Flynn?" asked Sig. After a moment, he smiled as he realized to whom she was referring. "Oh, Lucas. Right. Do you always call people by their first names, Mr. West?" asked Chloe. "Everyone except you, Miss Baldwin," said Sig with a smile. She pulled a lock of hair behind her ear and set Sig's glass down on a table. "And that isn't considered improper?" asked Chloe. "I thought you had seen the future," said Sig with a smile. "Well, I don't know how it works for Miss Mason," said Chloe, "but I didn't have the luxury of choosing visions that were of interest to me, only the things that my key showed me." "But you saw enough to know who the divine key-bearers were," said Sig. "Yes," admitted Chloe. "Well, to answer your question, it seems very natural," said Sig, "but perhaps I am a poor judge. In our time, many of the things that people might consider civilized have been cast aside. Polite conversation seems insignificant next to freeing slaves." "When you put it like that," said Chloe with a frown. "I'm sorry, Miss Baldwin," said Sig as he looked into her eyes. His voice was calm and sincere. "I do not mean to imply your priorities are wrong. You have obviously provided food and shelter to me and my companions, and I am grateful to you." "It is I who should express gratitude to you," said Chloe with a smile. "Were it not for you, I might have been taken by those detestable demon worshippers." "Well, we can't have that," said Sig with a smile. The gruffness of their original encounter had all but disappeared. She looked at the ground as she weighed whether or not to tell him what she was thinking. "What is it?" asked Sig. "Two things," she said as she looked at him. "First, I would like you to consider the possibility that this plan will not succeed. I've learned to trust Lucas when it comes to planning, said Sig, but I can see that you were worried. Chloe was happy that her point of view was being considered. Lincoln and Savannah would have immediately dismissed her now that she was without her divine key, but Sig was willing to listen. I'm not saying that the plan is bad, I just feel like we need a backup plan, she said, especially because we have been attacked by Sarah Hawkins' acolytes. The ability to predict our movements could make things difficult for us. Sig scratched his chin. You have something in mind? He asked. I do, said Chloe. The hospital. I think that we need to be ready to join up with the other Guardians there. I think that Mr. and Mrs. Thomas were right to worry about Dr. McCarthy. Safety in numbers? Asked Sig. Something like that, said Chloe with a smile. It will also be a good place to start in the investigation of Miss Patterson's death, since Mr. Crawford is there. All right, said Sig with a smile. We did agree to help with that. I'll go get horses ready. You said there was something else? Asked Sig. Oh, said Chloe as she blushed slightly and looked at the ground. It's not a big deal, but if you want, I don't mind if you... Sig scratched his head as he tried to think of what might be causing her to act so awkwardly. He looked down and noticed that his pants were zipped up. He did a quick check for foreign objects in his teeth with his tongue. Finally, she looked in his eyes. You can call me Chloe if you want, she said. He laughed loudly. All right, he said. Chloe. She smiled and rushed out of the room. Suddenly, Lizard appeared next to Sig. Sig whirled around defensively. Hey, easy, said Lizard with air quotes. I just wanted to tell you that Catherine's army should arrive in about 10 minutes. Is everything ready? Asked Sig. Lizard nodded. Would I be here if it wasn't? He asked with a smile. Sig smiled back. Lizard, before you go, said Sig, if we need to make a quick escape, what's the best way out? Off the top of my head, having an awesome relic that gives you the ability to teleport would be the best way out, said Lizard. Sig laughed as Lizard teleported away. The sound of gunfire echoed across the hills and captured Sig's attention. He rushed down the stairs to join his colleagues. Victor and Jennifer rushed up to him. We've got sandbags set up over by the house, said Victor. Lizard didn't see any guns, but it's better to be safe. Good thinking, Victor, said Sig. Have you talked to Stephanie? Asked Jennifer. Not recently, said Sig. You might want to. Something is not right, said Jennifer. Sig turned toward Stephanie. She was looking at the ground nervously. Kirana fired another round from her sniper rifle that echoed across the hills. As Sig approached Stephanie, the undead army appeared on the horizon. Stephanie, said Sig with a smile, how are you doing? She turned to him and shrugged, then pointed at the coming army. Yeah, I see them, said Sig. I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about you. Stephanie turned back to Sig. She took a stick and wrote in the dust at their feet. Sarah Hawkins is watching, she wrote. Sig's eyes widened, and he spun around defensively, but saw no other enemies close by. As soon as Stephanie noticed Sig had read the message, she kicked at it to make it illegible. She picked up a pistol and rushed out near Jonathan and Kirana, leaving Sig standing alone without any context or further explanation. Sig looked back at Stephanie. He remembered how angry he had become only a short time before, when he had learned that Stephanie had been captured by Zeta-28. He had imagined her trapped and frightened as the augments experimented on her. He remembered how calm she had seemed when they actually found her. Her strength had impressed him. It seemed ironic that now, after they were free from augment hands, and in what seemed to be a favorable position, she seemed more trapped and frightened than he had ever remembered. Sig thought about the implications of the demon prophetess watching them. If she knew what they were planning, then their entire strategy was at risk. He wondered why Stephanie had not mentioned that earlier, but then considered how a discussion might have been seen by Sarah, whereas the writing in the message may have escaped her view. He thought back to Chloe's warning that their strategy may not be successful, and wondered if Chloe had some insight that they did not. He turned back to the house and noticed Lucas and Row 82 were helping Chloe to get the maids into carriages. He wondered if Chloe had divulged anything more to Lucas. Suddenly, hundreds of screams took his attention. The army was advancing toward them quickly. As he turned back to the battle, he saw hundreds of acolytes rushing toward Kirana. Jonathan and Stephanie pulled her arms back, encouraging her to retreat. She finally relented and began coming back toward Sig. Sig could not help but smile as he saw how much Kirana hated the idea of retreating, even if it was done strategically. The horde of acolytes rushed toward them, and Sig grabbed his key. A large cylinder of gold flickered up around them as the demon worshippers rushed at them. Sig's eyes glowed brightly as he watched the enemy army rushing toward them. As they came closer, he could see their bony and rotted faces. Clearly, Catherine's work on the members of Archdemon's Hand was superior to what was left to her undead army. She and her colleagues had no signs of decay even 1,000 years later, other than Sarah Hawkins looking old. Sig wondered if there were some kind of honor among demon worshippers that compelled them to help one another. His thoughts returned to the army as he realized they were completely uninterested in him or his friends. They rushed around the golden shield as though it were a tree in the path of a river. The horde of enemies continued running until they reached the pit that Kirana had dug to prepare for Catherine. To his shock, several of the acolytes began lying down around the pit, and then others lied on top of the first. In a few minutes, there was a woven framework of undead bodies that covered the pit. Sig's eyes grew wide, and he turned to the others. "She knew what we would do," he whispered. Kirana had a frown on her face. Stephanie and Jonathan were looking at one another, communicating through the mind realm, but Sig had no idea what they were saying. He turned to the remainder of the horde of troops. From their midst, a red-robed acolyte appeared and slowly walked toward the golden cylinder in which Sig and his friends were protected. The other acolytes spread apart to create a path for their leader. Instead of a slender woman as they expected, they saw a large man approaching. "You're not Catherine Page," said Kirana in a disappointed voice. "You only now realize that?" mocked the acolyte leader. Kirana fired her rifle in the general direction of the leader and blasted a hole in his leg. Within moments, the hole mended itself together as he continued. "Listen, I don't really care about you or your shield here. I came to collect Chloe Baldwin." "You'll return empty-handed," said Sig resolutely. "Wrong," replied the acolyte. "An apprentice never returns empty-handed." "So you're her lackey?" said Kirana with a smirk. "What is this word, lackey?" asked the apprentice. "Well, it is of no importance. I will spare your lives if you will assist me in my task. If, on the other hand, you hinder me, I will sacrifice you to bring power to my key and new life to my army." "You will not find her," said Sig angrily. Suddenly the sound of horse hooves pounding against the ground arose from behind them. Chloe Baldwin was seated in the front of a carriage driving a team of horses. Kirana pressed her face into her palm. "What is she doing?" muttered Kirana. "Well, you didn't hinder me," said the apprentice, "but you didn't help me either." He turned to some of his troops and motioned to the key-bearers. "Stay here and watch them," he commanded. "The rest of you after Chloe Baldwin." The horde leapt up and began rushing toward the team of horses, leaving Sig, Stephanie, Jonathan, and Kirana behind.